Good morning, everyone. We're learning Mishnah Chala. We are in Paragimel chapter 3, Mishna Beis and Mishnah 2. I'd like to dedicate to this morning's learning in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shalamis Rabinowitz, Shalamis Bas Rabbi Yaakov Eliezer. So we have previously learned about meduma, which means if you have chulin grain, meaning not truma grain, that truma mixes into it, you need 100 times the non-truma to be able to nullify the truma so that a non-Kohen would be able to eat from this mixture. If you have less than that amount, then it's called meduma. It's a mixture. It's in doubt. And the whole thing is treated like truma that a non-Kohen may not eat it. And the same thing would apply in the case of challah. If you have a dough, and the dough is call it a chulin dough, and then some truma, flour, produce, whatever it may be, got mixed in. So now I have a situation of meduma, and depending on now that the ratio of the non-truma to the truma is, it'll make a difference whether it remains meduma in the state of doubt and treated like, and the whole thing is treated, the whole loaf is treated as a mixture of chulin and truma, or not. And if it has more than if you do have the 100 times of the non-truma to the truma, it's going to be nullified. Now, what's relevant to us is the fact that, as we have also learned previously, that if you have a dough that is meduma, there's no obligation to separate challah from it. The same way, there's no obligation to separate challah. The same way truma, if the Kohen gets truma, if the Kohen is given truma and he makes a dough out of it, he doesn't have to separate challah. If grain is treated like truma because there is a mixture and the truma that's mixed in isn't nullified, it's also treated like truma. You don't have to separate challah. Now, as we mentioned previously, let's just repeat it again. That is that this whole idea, this whole halacha, they need 100 times against the truma to nullify it is a rabbinic law. Really, according to Torah law, if it's the same type, the majority of chulin, of non-truma, is going to nullify the truma. Which means, really, according to Torah law, this is not truma. This is chulin. It's permissible for the non-Kohen to eat. And therefore, there should be no question of an obligation of challah from it because it's not truma. If it was truma, okay, then there's exemption from challah. But this is not truma. So why would there be an exemption? And the answer is that being that our obligation of challah nowadays, already from the times of the Mishna, was rabbinic in nature, therefore, when the Chachamim, when the sages set up the obligation of challah, they said the same way that truma is going to be exempt from challah, a mixture that we treat as truma is also going to be exempt from challah. That's how the sages set up the obligation of challah nowadays. That if because of the mixture that we say that we should, if because of the mixture that we say should be treated like truma, that mixture is going to be exempt from challah, just like regular truma is. So now the Mishnah is going to qualify this halacha that a dough that became a mixture of chulin and truma and is therefore forbidden and is therefore treated like truma, that we say that there is an obligation to separate challah from that dough. When do we say that? So the Mishnah says, Nidma isasa ad shelo gilgala. If her dough became meduma before she kneaded the dough, that means that we're talking about, as we learned previously, the obligation of challah takes effect when the dough is kneaded. We're talking about wheat flour. It's when the dough is kneaded. That's when the obligation takes effect. Before that, there is no obligation, but you could separate challah if you wanted to. So now, in this case, the case is that the dough became questionable, became mixed and forbidden before the obligation for the challah even took effect. So then we say patura. So then even when she makes it into a dough and the challah obligation should take effect, it's going to be exempt. Shamaduma pater. Because a dough that's meduma, a dough that's a mixture of truma and not truma, is that enough to nullify the truma? And therefore it's treated like truma, is going to be exempt. That means that when the obligation for challah should have taken effect, this dough was meduma, and therefore it's exempt. But let's say she kneaded the dough, and the obligation of challah took effect, and then it became meduma because truma fell in. then we say chayeves. Then you're going to be obligated. Meduma is not going to exempt from challah if the obligation for challah first took effect. It only is going to prevent the obligation from taking effect. Meduma, if a dough is meduma, it can prevent the obligation from taking effect. But it cannot take off a dough that already has the obligation of challah on it. That's the first part of the Mishnah. Then the Mishnah says another case. Noiled las fake tuma. If, let's say, questionable impurity, there was a question of impurity that now came upon this dough. So we've learned previously that one may not cause truma or challah to become tummy, and that's based on a verse in the Torah. Verse in the Torah says, you should guard my truma. Challah is called truma, and therefore we have to guard the challah and truma from becoming tummy. Now, if we're talking about a dough that already has the obligation of challah on it, it was kneaded into a dough, the obligation is there, so then there's no question that there's the Torah obligation to guard it from tumah. Because once the dough is made and the obligation of challah takes effect, so we see this piece of dough as dough with the challah that will be separated. There's challah there already. Since there's challah there already, you're obligated to make sure it doesn't become impure. If we're talking about before you kneaded the dough, which means before the obligation for challah took effect on this dough, then there's no challah there yet. And therefore the Torah's obligation to make sure that it doesn't become impure, it shouldn't be there. But there's a different issue. And that issue is that if it's already tameh before it became a dough, that means once it becomes a dough and the obligation of challah takes effect, it will be impure. And the challah they separated from it will be impure, and the Kohen's going to lose out because the Kohen then can't eat it. All he can do is burn it. And therefore, the sages say that there's an obligation even before it becomes a dough to make sure it doesn't become impure so that the challah will be separated, won't be impure, and the Kohen won't lose out. This is the introduction to this discussion. Okay? Now, our Mishnah is talking about where noilas fake tuma. A question of tuma came about. It's a question. Did this dough come into contact with a source of impurity or not? We have a safek tuma, a doubt of tuma on this dough, which means a doubt that whether the challah is tameh. Now, if there is a doubt whether the challah is tameh, then the Kohen can't eat it. Can't eat it. At the same time, okay, let's read the Mishnah. Noilas fake tuma. If a doubt of tuma now arose on this dough, ad shaloi gilgala, and it happened before she needed it, it happened before the obligation for challah took effect in this dough, te'aseh betuma, you can continue making the dough even if it becomes impure. Meaning, we have a dough, we have a question to become tummy or not. So really, what you want to do is if it's already questionable tuma. So if you're trying to be, if you're trying to have it remain tahar, you're not really going to gain much from it. The Kohen can't eat it, and whatever you want to gain is not going to be gained. If you wanted to, let's say, eat your food that is tahar, not that you're obligated, but there are definitely people who wanted to do that. But already a safek tuma came upon it. You're not going to gain much. The Kohen's not going to gain anything. Meaning, if I take this dough that's already has a safek of impurity, and now I want to continue making it in vessels that are impure, which is going to make it vaday tameh. It's going to make it certainly tameh. So we say like this: if the question of tuma, the questionable tuma, came about before you made it into a dough, which means before the obligation of challah took effect on the dough, so then we say, so let's look at the situation. Do I have an obligation to make sure this doesn't become impure? No, because the obligation for challah didn't take effect yet. Do I have to do something to prevent that Kohen shouldn't lose out? He lost out already. It's a safek. Once the doubt is there, he can't eat it. So there's nothing to be lost or gained if you now decide, okay, I'll just make the dough in a vessel that will for sure make a tummy. It doesn't make a difference. And that's what it means. Te'aseh betuma. If the question of tuma came about before he made it into a dough, then you could do the rest of it in a state of impurity. However, if let's say she already needed the dough, and after the dough was needed and the obligation for challah took effect, which means already is challah in this dough, then there was a question that it become impure, then we say taseh b'tahara. Then you have to do the rest of it in a state of tahara. You have to use vessels that are tahar, that are pure, to make sure, or you have to make sure you're pure, to make sure that you don't change it into something that is vaday tameh, into something that is for sure impure. And that is because the obligation the Torah puts upon us to guard truma and challah from becoming tameh when it's for sure truma and challah applies even in a case where there is a doubt as to whether it became tameh or not. The obligation to guard challah from becoming tameh is even if a doubt, it's already doubt, if there's a doubt on this challah, whether it's tameh or not. Even though it's already doubtful, maybe it's tameh, the Torah still says, make sure it doesn't for sure become tameh. That's only going to happen, though, if the obligation took effect and I have challah here. Only when I have challah in the dough does the Torah's obligation to guard it from tumah take effect. So if she needed the dough, and therefore the challah took effect, so there's challah in the dough, even though there's a suffix on it that maybe became tameh, nonetheless, the Torah's obligation of guarding it from becoming for sure tameh also applies. And therefore the Mishnah says, Umisha Gilgala, but if the doubt of tumah came about after she needed the dough, Teyaseh b'tahara, it has to be done in purity, because the Torah's obligation of guarding it still applies, because that obligation to guard challah and truma from becoming tameh applies even if there's already a question on the challah or truma that maybe it already became tameh. The Torah still gives you an obligation to make sure it for sure doesn't become tameh, and therefore you have to finish it up in a state of tahara, in a state of purity. But if the case were where the tumah took effect before the dough got an obligation of challah, so there is no challah here yet, and the Kohen can't eat it anyway, then we say you can finish it up even if you're going to make it for sure tameh. Okay, we're now starting in the laws of Lashon from the Chavetz Chaim, Klal Yud, chapter 10. And we're going to read this paragraph, but I want to make it clear that there are a lot of conditions about what we're going to learn in this paragraph, which is going to start in the next one, which we'll do in Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow. But the first thing the Chavetz Chaim is starting off with is the essential law. But again, this essential law is very dependent on a number of conditions. If you saw someone wrong someone else, you saw it, you know it. You saw him steal from him. You know that he cheated him. You know that he damaged him. Whether the person who was stolen from or damaged knows it or not, or you saw him embarrass him, you showed how you saw that he caused him suffering, you saw how he insulted him, and you know for sure he didn't return the stolen article, he didn't pay for his damages, he did not ask him for forgiveness. So it's interesting, you already see there's conditions here. You have to know for sure that he did this wrong. You have to know for sure that he didn't make up for it yet. Even if you saw this on your own, alone, meaning you're not part of a pair of witnesses, you don't have that power, you can still tell other people about it in order to aid the person who was wronged. And to make and to degrade and to deride these actions in front of people so that other people don't decide to do the same thing. So this is your goal. Your goal is either to help this person in some way or to make sure that people don't learn from this. The Chavetz Chaim says you may do so. Now we're talking about, if you remember before, where a person did a sin between man and God, there already some of the conditions were different. But here we're talking about again, and he's saying, and he says clearly, you know that he wronged him, and you know that he didn't make up for it. You may tell others about it for helping this other person, or so that people should look badly upon these kinds of actions so as not to learn from them. Have a wonderful day. Second. However, you cannot be missing any of the seven conditions that we will explain very soon. Have a great day.